The stone floors of Baron Valmere's great hall had been scrubbed 1,000 times before Lysa arrived, and they would be scrubbed 1,000 times after she was gone. She knew this. She counted on it. Her knuckles were raw. Her back ached in that deep, bone-level way that no amount of stretching could reach. Still, she kept moving the brush in slow, deliberate circles, methodical, quiet, invisible. Exactly as planned. She sat back on her heels for a moment and pressed the back of her wrist to her forehead, catching her breath without making a sound. 8 months. 8 months of cold stone and borrowed silence and careful watching. 8 months to get this close. The castle had felt different since morning. Sharper, faster. Servants moved through the corridors with the tight-shouldered urgency of people who knew someone important was arriving, someone whose opinion of the hall's cleanliness actually mattered. Fresh rushes had been laid in the antechamber. The Baron's best silver had been brought out and polished twice. Lysa had counted 4 different footmen carrying wine up from the cellars since dawn. She had learned to read this place the way she had once learned to read her father's face, by watching what people tried to hide. "You girl!" The voice cracked across the hall like a whip. Mistress Ordwin, the head housekeeper, stood in the arched doorway with her arms folded and her thin mouth pressed flat. She had the particular expression of a woman who had survived 2 decades of the Baron's household by making other people miserable first. "His lordship's treasury is to be prepared for receiving, candles lit, floors cleared, the eastern alcove set for display. You're to assist Henrik, then report to the kitchens before the evening bell." Lysa lowered her chin. "Yes, mistress." The footsteps receded. The hall breathed again. Lysa returned to her scrubbing, but her mind was already moving ahead, through the corridor, past the iron door she had memorized, to the eastern alcove and the locked cabinet she had not yet found a reason to stand near long enough to study. Important guests meant the Baron's attention would be stretched thin and pulled in directions that suited her. Distraction was the only currency she had ever been able to afford. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now, let's dive in. Her father had been publicly executed 12 years ago. Traitor, they called him. A man who had tried to betray his liege lord for coin. Lysa had been 11 years old, small enough to be overlooked in the crowd, close enough to see his face. He had not looked guilty. He had looked like a man who had found something he wasn't supposed to find, and had not run fast enough. The night before the soldiers came, he had pressed something cold and small into her hands. A silver ring, delicate and precise, etched with a wolf crest she had not recognized until years later. "Trust no baron," he had told her, voice barely above breath. "Especially Valmere." She wore the ring on a cord beneath her dress. It had touched her sternum every morning for 12 years. 6 months ago, she had finally found something to follow. A name buried in a merchant record, a record that placed her father's last known contact in Valmere's household the season before his arrest. She had started packing within the hour. Now she was here. Now she was close. The treasury was in the cellar, behind 3 locked doors. She had managed 2 of them already, on a night 2 weeks past when a kitchen fire had drawn the guards to the east wing. The 3rd door had not yielded, but she had seen enough to know that what she needed was inside. Account books, correspondence, proof that her father had not stolen anything, proof that he had simply known too much. Tonight, with the Baron performing for guests, the lower halls would be quieter. "Girl." A different voice this time, a kitchen maid, breathless, clutching the doorframe. They're saying it's the Alpha King. Cook wants everyone to the Great Hall. Now, move! The clay pitcher nearly slipped from Lysa's fingers. The Alpha King. She steadied her grip and followed the rush of servants toward the Great Hall, pulse hammering low, and even the way it always did when something changed too fast. The Alpha King had not been seen in this region in years. He had no reason to come to a minor baron's holding on the Western Road, unless he did. The Great Hall doors swung open ahead of her. Baron Valmere stepped forward, his broad face arranged into welcome, his small dark eyes calculating something she couldn't read. "Your Majesty," he announced, spreading his arms wide. "I will grant you any wish." Lysa moved to the edge of the room. She kept her eyes down. She did not see the king look past the gold. She did not see him raise his hand. She only felt the silence, sudden, total, wrong, before someone nearby whispered her name, and then the baron's voice, stunned and strange. Her. The room had not moved, but something inside it had shifted. Lysa kept her eyes down and her breathing even. She had survived 8 months in this household by being exactly what no one wanted to look at. A grey dress, braided hair, a pitcher of clay that cost less than the floor it stood on. She had made herself into furniture, and furniture did not get chosen by kings. And yet... "Her," the Baron said again. And this time, it wasn't a question so much as a thing he was turning over in his hands, trying to find where it had gone wrong. "The Maid," King Alaric confirmed. His voice was even, unhurried, the voice of a man who rarely repeated himself and knew it. "I choose her." Valmere's practiced smile tightened at the corners. "Your Majesty, surely..." He spread his hands, gesturing toward the room around them, the silver on the tables, the stacked relics in their velvet cases. "You have your pick of anything within these walls. Land deeds, coin reserves. I have a collection of Varenthian steel that even the royal armory has not. I have made my choice." The Baron stopped talking. Lysa made herself walk forward, one step, then another. The pitcher was steady in her hands because she willed it to be, and her face was blank because she had practiced blank until it cost her nothing. She crossed the distance between the edge of the room and the place where the king stood, and she kept her gaze at the level of his chest. Then the warmth hit her. It was not heat from the torches. It was something else. Something low and strange, a pull at the center of her ribs like a lodestone finding north. She nearly stopped walking. She didn't. She came to stand at the edge of the king's shadow and fixed her eyes on the floor and breathed. "You may lower the tray." She set it down on the nearest table. The king did not step away. If anything, he stepped slightly closer. And when he spoke again, his voice dropped. Not whispered exactly, but pitched for her ears alone, beneath the ambient shuffling of guards and the Baron's strained attempt to recover his composure. "You've been searching the treasury." Her pulse spiked hard. She did not let it reach her face. "I don't know what you mean, Your Majesty." His gaze dropped briefly, not to her face. Lower. To the neckline of her dress, where the cord disappeared beneath the fabric. She felt the ring press against her sternum as though it had suddenly remembered it was there. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise, something older than surprise. "You wear his crest," he said quietly. The floor felt less solid than it had a moment ago. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not cost her everything. It was Valmere who filled the silence, and she would spend a long time afterward deciding whether that had been a mercy or the beginning of her undoing. "Your Majesty," the Baron said, moving closer with the careful energy of a man trying to redirect a river. "Perhaps I should explain. The girl, she is Captain Rowan's daughter." The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. She heard it ripple. felt the guards shift, felt the temperature of the air change in some way she couldn't name. King Alaric's jaw tightened. It was the first expression he'd let fully through. Valmere pressed on, his voice smoothing into something almost reasonable. Her father was the man executed for treason against your father's crown. She is no one of consequence, Majesty, a servant from the lower quarters. I only mention it so that you understand. Choosing her is not without complication. I am not unfamiliar with complication, the king said. The northern clans are already restless, Valmere continued. Quieter now, harder. I have offered you my loyalty, my resources, my full cooperation against the rebellion. In exchange, I need your protection. That arrangement requires trust, Your Majesty. And trust requires... Requires what? Exactly. The Baron's mouth closed. Alaric turned back to Lysa then. He looked at her the way she imagined men looked at things they intended to keep, not with hunger, but with a kind of settled certainty. Then she is mine. 3 words, quiet as a verdict. And something in the way he said it made Lysa think he was not talking to the Baron at all. They did not take her to a guest chamber. They took her to the treasury. She recognized the irony, the room she had been trying to reach for 8 months, and it had taken a king's command to open the door. The guards fell back at Alaric's signal, and then it was the 3 of them alone. The king, the Baron, and the daughter of a dead man standing among mountains of coin and candlelight that turned everything gold. Lysa kept her hands loose at her sides. She had learned a long time ago that clenched fists told people too much about what was happening inside you. Valmere had regathered himself during the walk. He stood near the central table with his shoulders squared, wearing the expression of a man who had survived difficult conversations before and intended to survive this one. His eyes moved between her and the king with the careful calculation of someone counting exits. Alaric spoke first. "I want to hear it from you," he said. And it took Lysa a moment to realize he was speaking to her, not the Baron. What you came here looking for. She weighed the cost of honesty against the cost of another lie and decided that whatever this king knew, he already knew more than she could afford to bluff against. "Proof," she said. "That my father did not steal anything." "He didn't." The certainty in his voice stopped her cold. She looked at him fully for the first time. Really looked, the way she hadn't allowed herself in the hall. He was younger than she'd expected for a man who carried that much stillness. The scar along his jaw was old, healed silver white. His amber eyes were level and without performance. "I was 17 when the trial was held," Alaric continued, his gaze moving briefly to Valmere before returning to her. "I sat in that room. I watched your father's face through the entire proceeding. I have seen guilty men. I know what they look like." "Then why?" Her voice caught. She steadied it. "Why was he executed?" "Because the evidence was arranged against him. And because the man who arranged it had the ear of my father's counsel." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Lysa had ever heard. She turned to Valmere. He had not moved, but something in his posture had changed. A tightening, a drawing inward. The expression of a man who had just watched a wall he thought was solid develop a crack. "Captain Rowan filed a report," Alaric said, his voice still even, but with something harder underneath it now. 18 months before his arrest. Submitted directly to the Crown's Treasury Office. Embezzlement, systematic, over several years, routed through merchant contracts and land assessments. Lysa heard her own breathing. "He reported you," she said. She was not speaking to the king. Valmere's jaw shifted. "Your father was a soldier who overstepped his understanding of commerce. He misread figures. He drew incorrect. What did my father know?" Her voice came out harder than she intended. She did not apologize for it. "Tell me exactly what he found." The Baron looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not remorse, but a kind of tired contempt, the look of a man who had been inconvenienced by the same problem twice. "He knew too much," Valmere said finally. "And he had the particular misfortune of being too honorable to stay quiet about it." The words landed like a closed door. The king drew his sword. It was not a violent motion. It was quiet and deliberate, the way everything about Alaric seemed to be quiet and deliberate, and that made it worse somehow. Made the blade catching the candlelight feel more like a sentence than a threat. Valmere went very still. "You will appear before your court at dawn," Alaric said. "You will give a full accounting. Every ledger, every contract, every transaction that touched Rowan's case. And if I refuse, then I stop asking." The Baron's eyes moved slowly from the blade to the king's face. Whatever he found there made him look away first. "Very well," he said quietly. "Dawn." Alaric sheathed his sword. Lysa watched the Baron turn toward the door and caught something she was not meant to see. Just a flicker. There and gone, at the corner of his mouth. Not defeat, calculation. He was already thinking 3 steps ahead, and she had no idea yet what those steps were. Dawn came grey and cold, the kind of morning that felt like a warning. Baron Valmere's great hall had been rearranged overnight. The long feasting tables pushed back. The dais at the far end cleared, chairs brought in for the noble households, whose representatives had already been summoned before most of them had finished sleeping. Lysa counted 11 lords and their attendants by the time the doors were sealed. She stood at the edge of the room in the same grey dress, the same braided hair, and watched the Baron take his place at the center of the floor with the composed expression of a man who had spent the night preparing for exactly this. That was the first thing that told her something was wrong. King Alaric stood to the side of the dais, not seated, not elevated, deliberately lateral. Lysa had noticed that about him. He did not perform authority. He simply occupied space until the room adjusted itself around him. Valmere bowed to the assembly. Then he began. "My lords," he said, his voice carrying the particular warmth of a man addressing friends, "I have asked you here this morning because integrity demands it, because whatever my failings, I will not allow them to become secrets." Lysa's jaw tightened. He was already framing it. The confession that followed was masterfully incomplete. Valmere admitted to what he called accounting irregularities, sums misallocated across estate budgets, merchant contracts that had not been properly disclosed to the Crown's ledger office. He used the word errors 4 times. He used the word oversight twice. He referenced his late treasurer, a man 2 years dead who could not contradict a single syllable. He did not once say Rowan's name. When a lord near the front asked directly whether the confession bore any relation to the captain executed 12 years prior, Valmere's expression moved through something that looked, from a distance, almost like sorrow. "Captain Rowan was a good soldier," he said carefully. "Whatever conclusions he drew from incomplete information, I believe he drew them honestly. His errors of interpretation were his own. I bear him no ill will." Errors of interpretation. The room shifted. Lysa felt it. The subtle rebalancing of weight, the way several lords exchanged glances that meant they were deciding something, not about guilt or innocence, about narrative, about which version of events was more useful to believe. A man 2 seats from the front leaned toward his neighbor and said something she couldn't hear. But she could read the shape of the words well enough. Why choose a maid? She had heard versions of it twice already this morning. moving through the assembly in whispers with the easy persistence of a rumor that wanted to become a fact. The king had come for trade negotiations, for protection agreements, for political alliance, and instead he had pointed at a servant girl and called it a wish. The story didn't make sense to people who needed things to make sense, and when things didn't make sense, people invented reasons until they found one that did. He's seizing the estate. The girl is a pretext. Valmere crossed him somehow. This is leverage. The maid is no maid. Someone sent her. That last one was closest to true, which made it the most dangerous. When the formal proceedings closed and the assembly broke into the low-charged murmur of people who had witnessed something they hadn't fully understood, Lysa felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. Her father's name had not been spoken. His record had not been addressed. A man had stood in a public hall and confessed to nothing, and the room had let him. She became aware of the king beside her before she heard him move. He had that quality, presence that arrived slightly ahead of him, like displaced air. "You're calculating," he said quietly. "He performed," she replied, keeping her voice low. Everything he said was designed to make the real confession impossible to demand without looking like persecution. Yes. A partial admission protects him. It gives his allies something to point to as good faith. And it buries my father deeper because now there's no official record that connects the two things. Alaric was quiet for a moment. "Do you want justice?" he asked. "Or the truth?" She looked at him. "Both," she said. "And I know where to find it." The king said no twice before he said yes. The first time was in the corridor outside the great hall, when Lysa told him what she intended. He listened without interrupting, which she was already learning meant he was taking her seriously. And then he said no, with the quiet finality of someone who had already considered the risk and decided it wasn't acceptable. The second time was an hour later, when she laid out the specific route. The servants' passage behind the east kitchen, the hollow section of wall on the second landing she had found in her third week, the fact that the Baron's private study had a different lock than the treasury, and she had spent 6 weeks finding its weakness. Alaric listened to all of it and then said no again, and she could see in his expression that he meant it less than the first time. "If you send your own men," she said, "Valmere will know by morning. He has informants in his own household. I have spent 8 months becoming invisible in this castle. That is something your guards cannot replicate in a single night." A long pause. "If something goes wrong, then I have already decided the risk is worth it." He looked at her steadily. She looked back. 2 hours, he said finally. "If you are not back in 2 hours, I come in myself." She didn't wait for him to change his mind. The castle settled into itself differently after midnight. The fires banked low, the guard rotations thinned. The sounds of the building shifting in the cold became the dominant noise. Lysa had learned the rhythm of it weeks ago, which floorboards spoke, which corridors echoed, where the gaps were between one patrol ending and the next beginning. She moved through the servants' passage with her back to the stone, and her breathing measured, the candle she carried shielded behind her palm to a thin thread of light. The hollow section of wall on the second landing opened with the same 3-point pressure she had practiced until her fingers knew it without thinking. She slipped through. The Baron's private study was at the end of a short corridor that smelled of old paper and tallow. The lock was a double mechanism, unusual for a private room, which had told her everything she needed to know about what it was protecting. She had the pick tools from a locksmith's kit she'd lifted from a market 2 towns over. Traveling here. 40 seconds. She was inside. She went straight for the cabinet behind the desk. The first drawer held correspondence, routine estate matters, tenant disputes, harvest assessments. She moved past them. The second drawer was locked with a secondary mechanism, smaller, recessed. She worked it carefully, listening for the patrol she knew would pass the corridor below in approximately 6 minutes. The lock gave. Inside were 3 bound folios and a collection of letters tied with a black cord. She opened the first folio and read by candlelight, and the cold in the room seemed to deepen as she turned pages. The numbers were meticulous. Withdrawals routed through fictitious merchant names, redistributed across land contracts that didn't exist, drawn from accounts that appeared in no official ledger. The embezzlement was not careless. It was architectural, built over years by someone who understood the Crown's accounting system well enough to design spaces inside it where money could disappear. The letters were worse. She untied the cord and read the first 2 quickly, then stopped and read the third one twice to make sure she was understanding it correctly. The northern clans had not rebelled spontaneously. They had been funded. Supply routes, weapons, grain stores to sustain a prolonged campaign, all of it flowing from a single source, routed through intermediary traders, untraceable unless you had the letters in your hand confirming every transaction. Baron Valmere had not simply prepared for the rebellion. He had built it. He had created the threat that brought the king to his door, so that he could offer the king protection against a crisis of his own manufacture. Leverage dressed as loyalty, a war staged to make himself indispensable. Lysa's hands had gone very still. She began folding letters into her dress. She didn't hear him until the knife was already at her throat. "Put them down," said a voice behind her, low, controlled, and entirely unsurprised. Slowly. The Baron's captain. He had been waiting. The captain's name was Drev, and he was not a cruel man. Lysa had observed that much in 8 months. He followed orders with the particular efficiency of someone who had decided, long ago, that the shape of his loyalty mattered less than its consistency. He held the knife steady without pressing it into her skin, which told her he was waiting for instruction rather than acting on his own judgment, which meant someone had told him she was coming. She kept her hands visible and her breathing slow and thought about the letters still folded against her ribs. They moved her to the great hall. It took less than 20 minutes for the room to fill, guards first, then the Baron's household retainers, then Valmere himself, dressed with a completeness that confirmed he had not been asleep. He stood at the center of the hall and looked at her with the expression of a man who had just watched a gamble pay out. Alaric was already there. She didn't know how he had known, only that he was standing near the far wall with 2 of his own guard at his shoulders, and the stillness about him that she was learning meant he was angry in a way he was not yet choosing to express. His eyes moved to her throat where Drev's knife had been, then to her face. She gave the smallest shake of her head. "I'm unhurt." Something in him settled, fractionally. "A straightforward situation," Valmere said, addressing the room with the ease of a man on familiar terrain. "My captain found this woman in my private study, in possession of documents she had no right to access. Under the laws of this holding, that constitutes theft. Under Crown law, given the sensitivity of what she was carrying." He paused, letting the weight of the next word land deliberately. "It constitutes treason." The murmur that moved through the assembled guards was exactly what he wanted. "I am prepared to be lenient," the Baron continued. "The girl is young. Perhaps she was acting on someone else's instruction." His eyes moved briefly, pointedly, to the king. "I ask only that the documents be returned to my keeping, and the matter will be considered closed. And if they are not returned, then I bring charges against her." Another pause. "Tonight." Lysa watched Alaric's face and saw the geometry of the trap being laid out in his expression. The moment he understood it fully, all its angles. Hand over the evidence, and Valmere walked free, his manufactured rebellion intact, the letters buried again. Refuse. And Lysa faced a treason charge in a holding where Valmere controlled the court, the guards, and the morning's narrative. Political leverage against a woman's life. It was, she had to admit, elegantly constructed. The silence stretched. She could feel the room calculating alongside it. Lords' representatives who had stayed after dawn, guards whose allegiances ran in complicated directions, servants in doorways who would carry whatever happened here through the castle by morning. Alaric took 3 steps forward, not toward her, toward Valmere. "You offered me any wish," he said. His voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. "I chose her. I do not bargain what I claim." Valmere's expression shifted. "Your Majesty, the law you are invoking belongs to the crown. I am the crown's representation in this room, and I am telling you that this woman is under my protection, which means any charge you bring against her, you bring against me." The Baron's composure developed its first genuine crack. "You would sacrifice a political alliance for a servant. I would sacrifice a corrupt alliance for an honest one every time." What happened next happened fast. Drev moved, not toward Lysa, but toward the king. And that was the miscalculation that unraveled everything, because Alaric's guards were already moving before the captain had taken 2 steps, and the room dissolved into the controlled chaos of men who had trained for exactly this, and men who hadn't. Lysa didn't wait. She knew the hall's edges better than anyone in it. She went left, through the servants' access behind the tapestry, through the narrow corridor that ran parallel to the kitchens, and she ran, not away from the castle, but toward the king's carriage in the outer yard, where his second guard had been stationed since arrival. She reached him breathing hard, the letters still pressed against her ribs, still intact, still enough. The northern clans arrived before dawn. Lysa heard them first, not the sound of an army exactly, but the sound of a landscape changing, the distant percussion of hooves and iron that the castle walls couldn't entirely swallow. She was in the outer yard with Alaric's second guard, a weathered man named Court, who had taken the letters from her without a word and locked them in the carriage strongbox with the efficiency of someone who had been trusted with important things before. She heard the horns next, 2 short, 1 long. Court's head came up. "That's a perimeter signal." "They're at the North Road," Lysa said. 20 minutes out, if they're coming from the ridge camp." He looked at her sharply. "You knew about a ridge camp." "I knew about everything Valmere thought was worth hiding." She was already moving back toward the castle entrance when the great hall doors burst open and Alaric came through them with his guard at his shoulder and blood on his sleeve that she didn't think was his. He saw her, some of the controlled tension in his face eased by a fraction. "The Baron?" she asked. "Retreated to the inner wing. His captain is contained." His eyes moved to the north wall where the horn signal was still echoing. "How many?" "I don't know numbers, but I know they've been supplied for a sustained campaign. The letters confirmed grain stores and weapons caches." She paused. "There's a secondary gate on the castle's eastern side. It's old, not on the official plans, but it's been kept clear. If Valmere staged this, he staged an exit for himself too." Alaric held her gaze for one deliberate moment. "Show me." The castle's household had fractured along the lines that fear always revealed. The Baron's personal retainers had retreated inward, calculating survival odds. The crown-loyal guards were moving to defensive positions, and in the middle of it all, approximately 40 servants, kitchen staff, chambermaids, stable hands, were standing in the inner corridor with nowhere to go and no one telling them anything. Lysa found them on her way to the eastern passage. She stopped. She thought of 8 months of grey dresses and lowered eyes and the careful practice of being forgettable. Then she thought of her father, who had been too honourable to stay quiet. "Listen to me," she said, and her voice came out steady and certain in a way that surprised even her. The cellar storage rooms on the south side have stone walls 4 feet thick and a single iron door that bolts from the inside. You will be safer there than anywhere else in this building. Take whatever food you can carry from the kitchens on your way. Go now and go quickly. A beat of silence. Then the head cook, a broad woman named Pyrrha, who had never once acknowledged Lysa's existence in 8 months, gave a short nod and started moving, and the rest followed. Lysa moved on. The eastern passage was where she'd known it would be, a low archway behind a storage room, the door disguised as shelving until you knew to look for the seam. She brought Alaric through it and showed him the supply corridor beyond, the one that ran beneath the castle's east wall and emerged in the outer yard near the stables. "He'll use this," she said. "He'll take coin and whatever documents he hasn't surrendered, and he'll be gone before the fighting resolves. Then we close it from the outside." She showed him where. He gave the order to Court, who took 2 men and went. The battle for the castle's walls was brief and loud, and decided by the fact that the northern clans had been promised an undefended holding and found instead a king who had not arrived alone. By the time the sun was fully up, the outer yard was secured, and the clan leaders were being held for questioning in the barn, looking considerably less certain of their arrangement than they had been the night before. Alaric found Lysa on the eastern wall, watching the road. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking. "You commanded them," he said finally. "The servants. Someone had to." He said nothing else, but she felt his gaze on the side of her face, measuring something, the way he sometimes did, as though he was revising a calculation he thought he'd already finished. Below them, in the outer yard, one of Court's men was walking toward the wall with a report in his hand and urgency in his stride. They had found the eastern passage open. The shelving door was ajar. The Baron was already gone. He hadn't gone far. That was the thing about men who had spent their lives inside systems they controlled. They couldn't fully imagine existing outside them. Valmere had taken the eastern passage, crossed the outer yard, and made it as far as the treasury. Of course he had. Lysa found him there alone, stuffing coin purses into a travel satchel with the focused desperation of a man who had finally run out of moves but hadn't accepted it yet. A torch burned in the wall bracket. Gold light caught the edges of everything and made the room look the way it had on the night she arrived. Rich and sealed and indifferent. He heard her footsteps and turned. For a moment, he simply looked at her. Then something in his expression curdled into a familiar contempt, the kind that had probably kept him warm through a long career of difficult decisions. "The maid," he said, not mocking exactly, something flatter than mockery. "Come to see the ending? I came to make sure you didn't leave before it." He turned back to the satchel. "Your father said something similar once. Stood in this room, in fact, very certain that righteousness was its own protection." He pulled the drawstring tight. "It wasn't." Her hands were steady at her sides. "Say it plainly," she said. "You've run out of audiences to perform for. Just say it." Valmere looked at her again, and perhaps because there was nothing left to lose, or perhaps because men like him always wanted someone to know, he said it. "I framed him. The report he filed would have ended me. 12 years of careful construction, dismantled by one honorable man who couldn't be reasoned with or bought. A short, mirthless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I gave the Crown's investigator evidence that Rowan had fabricated the embezzlement claims to cover his own theft. It wasn't difficult. People believe what they're handed when it's handed to them with confidence. The treasury felt very small. "He died for telling the truth," Lysa said. "He died for telling it to the wrong people." Valmere lifted the satchel. "This is how power works, girl. It always has. The people who survive are the ones who understand that survival justifies the method. And the people who didn't survive, casualties of someone else's ambition, your father included." She heard the door behind her. Alaric entered without urgency, the way he did everything, and crossed the room until he was standing slightly ahead of her and to the left. Not in front of her, she noticed. Beside her. Valmere's eyes moved to him with the rapid calculation of a man running odds he already knew were bad. "Your Majesty." The Baron drew himself up with a remnant of his old composure. "Before you act, consider what your father's reign was built on. Alliances like mine. Arrangements like this." He let that sit for a moment. "Your father was no better." The room went quiet. Alaric's expression didn't collapse or harden, it simply settled into something very clear. "That is why I must be," he said. Valmere had no answer for that. The guards came through the door 30 seconds later. The Baron did not resist. He had the deflated quality of a man whose last card had been played and lost. The satchel still in his hand, surrounded by all the gold he hadn't managed to carry out. They took him without drama, and the sound of his footsteps receded down the corridor until the treasury was quiet again. Lysa stood in the middle of the room for a long moment. "He admitted it," she said, "in front of witnesses." "Yes. There will be a formal proceeding." "Yes," Alaric said again. "And you will be asked what sentence you want brought before the tribunal. As the primary injured party, your testimony carries significant weight." She had thought about this. She had thought about it for 12 years in the vague, burning way of someone who doesn't quite believe the moment will ever actually arrive. Execution, exile, public disgrace. She had imagined all of them at different points, in different moods, with different degrees of satisfaction. She looked at the door where they had taken him. "A lawful trial," she said. "Full proceedings. Every document entered into the public record. Every name. That will take time. I know." She turned to face him. "My father deserves the truth on record, not just an ending, the whole truth in the open, where it can't be buried again." Alaric studied her. "Justice," he said quietly. "Not revenge." "They were never the same thing," she replied. "I just needed long enough to be sure I knew the difference." The trial took 11 days. Every session was open to the public record, as she had asked. Every document entered, every name spoken aloud in the formal language of Crown proceedings, the merchant fronts, the false evidence, the correspondence with the northern clan leaders that had turned a manufactured grievance into a staged war. Valmere's allies in the noble assembly had gone quiet in the particular way of men who were hastily reviewing their own ledgers and hoping no one looked too carefully in their direction. Some of them would be reviewed anyway. On the 12th day, the tribunal delivered its findings. Baron Edric Valmere was stripped of his title, his lands, and his seat. His estate would pass to Crown administration pending reassignment. His co-conspirators in the northern arrangement were named and summoned. The clan leaders who had been paid to rebel rather than chosen to were offered terms, not lenient ones, but honest ones, which turned out to be something they hadn't encountered in long enough that several of them accepted within the hour, and Captain Aldrich Rowan, formerly of the Crown Guard, executed in the 12th year of the previous reign on charges of theft and treason, was formally exonerated. The record clerk read it without flourish, in the same flat procedural tone used for every other finding. Lysa sat in the gallery and listened to her father's name come out clean on the other side of a sentence, and she did not cry. She had not expected to, and she didn't. She simply sat very still and let it settle into her the way cold water settles, finding every hollow place. The memorial stone was placed 3 days later, in the courtyard of the Crown Guard's barracks in the capital. A small, precise marker in grey granite with his name and rank, and a single line beneath, "Faithful in truth when truth was dangerous." She had written the line herself when Alaric asked her what she wanted it to say. She stood in front of it for a long time after the formal party had withdrawn. The courtyard was quiet. Someone had left early crocuses at the base of the stone, pale purple against the grey, and she didn't know who had thought to do that but was grateful for it. She heard him approach and didn't turn. "You are free," Alaric said. He came to stand beside her, not quite close enough to intrude. The proceedings are complete. Your father's name is restored. There is nothing that compels you to remain." The word "remain" sat in the air between them. She looked at the stone for another moment, at her father's name, solid and permanent, and finally, in the correct form. Then she turned. "You could have wished for anything," she said. "In that treasury, gold, land, soldiers, he was offering you everything." Alaric's expression was the same one he'd worn the first night. That quality of having already considered something carefully before speaking. "I know." "Why her?" she asked, not performing confusion, genuinely asking the same question that had been underneath everything else for 11 days of proceedings and 3 days of waiting and one long quiet moment in front of a grey stone. Why me? He was quiet for long enough that she knew the answer mattered to him, that he wasn't reaching for something convenient, but for something true. "Because you were the only person in that room," he said, "who was there for the right reason." She held that. "I did." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one, the expression of a man who had said exactly what he meant and knew it. "I wished for someone who fights corruption from the inside, who understands what justice costs, who chooses the right thing not because it's easy, but because the alternative is unacceptable." A pause. "I wished for an ally." The carriage was waiting in the outer yard. She had known it was there, had watched Court prepare it that morning with the neutral efficiency that characterized everything the man did, on neither assuming she would stay nor assuming she would go. She looked at it now, then she walked toward it. Alaric fell into step beside her without comment, without ceremony, the way two people walk together when the decision has already been made and doesn't require announcement. She climbed in first. He followed. The door closed. The carriage moved. Behind them, Valmere's castle diminished through the window. The walls she had scrubbed, the corridors she had memorized, the treasury door she had spent 8 months trying to reach, all of it growing smaller, then gone. The girl who had survived by being invisible had finally stepped into the light, and she did not look back. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments and subscribe. Your support decides what tale the moon whispers next.